Welcome to LexTalks Legal Topics, Simplified, a guide to legal fundamentals for beginners. Today we're diving deep into a concept that's super relevant to Indian legal studies: the interplay between military necessity and the principle of humanity during armed conflict. You might be thinking, isn't war just about winning?
Well,
Well, it's not that simple.
no, it's not.
Even in the chaos of war, there are rules.
That's right.
Rules that aim to minimize suffering and destruction, especially for civilians.
Yeah, it's a fascinating area. We call it International Humanitarian Law, or IHL for short. Many people refer to this as the law of war, but it's not about stopping wars. It's about setting rules for how they're fought.
So even in war, there's a legal and ethical tightrope walk between achieving military goals and upholding human dignity.
Exactly. It's a delicate balance, and every action in war has consequences intended or unintended. For a nation like India, with its complex regional dynamics and a history of conflict understanding, IHL is crucial.
Okay, let's unpack these concepts. What exactly is military necessity?
Think of it as a justification for certain actions during armed conflict. It's definitely not a blank check to do whatever it takes to win. The modern view is that it must operate within specific limits set by international humanitarian law.
So it's not a free-for-all, thankfully. Where does the principle of humanity fit into all of this?
Right, that's the counterbalance. The principle of humanity is all about minimizing suffering and upholding human dignity even in the midst of war. It's enshrined in things like the Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols.
Additional protocols, what are those?
Good question. The Geneva Conventions are a set of treaties that establish the core rules of IHL. They've been around for a while, but warfare keeps evolving, so countries came together and created additional rules to address new challenges. These are known as additional protocols.
So they're like updates to the rulebook for war.
Exactly. And a really important one for our discussion is Additional Protocol I from 1977. It clarifies a lot of things about how we apply the principles of military necessity and humanity in modern warfare.
So these principles are constantly being refined and updated.
Yes, because warfare itself is constantly changing. Think about cyber warfare or autonomous weapons. Totally different from the wars of the past, but the fundamental principles still apply.
It sounds super complex. Do you have any real-world examples to help us understand how these principles work in practice?
Absolutely. Take the St. Petersburg Declaration of 1868. Before that, exploding bullets were becoming increasingly popular. They caused horrific injuries, but militaries argued they were necessary. The declaration essentially said, hold on, the goal is to weaken the enemy's army, not to inflict unnecessary suffering. So they banned exploding bullets for use against soldiers. It was an early example of the world coming together to balance military needs with humanitarian concerns.
So a bullet that disables a soldier is acceptable, but one designed to cause excruciating pain is not. That makes sense.
Exactly. And that principle minimizing unnecessary suffering is at the heart of IHL. Another example and a key part of additional protocol is the principle of distinction.
Distinction, what's that all about?
It means differentiating between combatants, those actively fighting, and civilians and their respective property. Article 52 of Additional Protocol gets very specific about what can and cannot be targeted. You can't just bomb a whole city because there's a military base somewhere within it.
So even if there's a military advantage in hitting a civilian target, it might be deemed unlawful under IHL.
That's right. It really emphasizes the importance of being precise and targeted in military actions, even when it's difficult. This is especially crucial for India, given its role in international peacekeeping missions, where protecting civilians is paramount.
That makes sense. So distinction is about identifying the right target. What about the level of force used?
That's where the principle of proportionality comes in. It basically says the damage you cause can't be excessive compared to the military gain you expect.
So if taking out a key enemy position would mean heavy civilian losses, it might not be considered proportional.
Exactly. It's not always about exact numbers. Imagine a small village that harbors a high-value enemy target. You could carpet bomb the entire village to guarantee the target's destruction, but the collateral damage would be immense. Would the military advantage gained really outweigh the cost in human life?
These are tough calls.
Yeah.
It's not just about strategy. It's about weighing the potential harm against the potential gain. It sounds like there's a lot of room for debate and interpretation.
You're right. Applying these principles in the real world is far from straightforward. Even with clear rules, there's always room for interpretation, especially in the fog of war.
So it's not just about knowing the rules, but also about making sound judgment under pressure. That must be incredibly challenging for military leaders and legal experts.
It is. And there's another layer of complexity, the principle of precautions in attack.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What does that entail?
Even when targeting a legitimate military objective, you have to take steps to minimize civilian harm whenever possible. It's about choosing weapons and tactics that are less likely to cause widespread damage.
So even if you've identified the right target, you still have to think about the best way to hit it to minimize collateral damage.
Precisely. It could mean choosing to attack at night when fewer civilians are around, or using more precise weapon even if it takes longer to deploy. It emphasizes responsible decision-making at all levels, from field commanders to policymakers in India.
This all highlights the human element of war, even with all the rules and legal frameworks. It's ultimately about people making decisions with life or death consequences.
That's a crucial point, and those decisions can have ripple effects that last long after the fighting stops. It's something we'll explore further as we continue our deep dive.
This is already so insightful. I can see how understanding these principles is essential for anyone interested in Indian legal studies, especially with the country's increasing role in international affairs. I can't wait to unpack this further.
There's a lot more to explore. The balance between military necessity and humanity is constantly evolving, influenced by international courts, NGOs, and even evolving technology.
We were just talking about how these principles have to be applied in really complex real-world situations. And you mentioned evolving technology. That makes me think about things like cyber warfare. How do these principles work when the battlefield isn't a physical place?
Yeah, that's one of the biggest challenges facing IHL today. The cyber warfare blurs so many lines. Is attacking a computer server a legitimate military objective? What if that server controls a power grid?
So taking out a server might give you a tactical advantage, but could also leave a whole city without electricity.
Right. And that raises the question of proportionality. How do you assess the potential harm when a cyber attack could have these cascading effects? It's not like bombing a bridge where the damage is relatively contained.
It seems like judging proportionality in cyber warfare would be a nightmare.
It is, and it's just one example of how new technologies are pushing the boundaries of IHL. Another hot topic is autonomous weapon systems, sometimes called killer robots.
Okay, so we're talking about machines that can make life or death decisions without human involvement. That sounds scary.
It's certainly raising serious ethical and legal questions. Can an algorithm really distinguish between a combatant and a civilian? What about proportionality? Can a machine understand the nuances of a situation and make those difficult judgment calls?
And what about accountability? If an autonomous weapon commits a war crime, who's to blame? The programmer, the commander who deployed it. It's a bit of a legal minefield, isn't it?
Absolutely. There's a growing movement to preemptively ban autonomous weapons, arguing that we should never hand over the power to kill to machines. On the other hand, some people argue that autonomous weapons could actually make warfare more humane.
More humane? How's it even possible?
Well, the argument is that machines, unlike humans, aren't susceptible to emotions like fear, anger, or revenge. They could, in theory, be programmed to strictly follow IHL, potentially reducing civilian casualties and unnecessary suffering.
Okay, that's an interesting point.
Yeah.
But it still feels a bit unsettling to me.
I understand that feeling. It's a complex issue with no easy answers. But it does highlight the fact that IHL isn't some static set of rules. It has to adapt to new technologies and the changing nature of warfare if it's going to remain relevant.
So, are we headed toward a future where wars are fought by algorithms?
It's hard to say for sure. The future of warfare will likely be shaped by a combination of technological advancements, legal developments, and societal values. But one thing's certain, the tension between military necessity and the principle of humanity will remain at the core of it all.
It seems like we're just scratching the surface of a very complex and constantly evolving field.
We are. But going back to the basics, even with these new challenges, some of the core principles of IHL remain as relevant as ever.
You're right. We were talking earlier about minimizing unnecessary suffering. But where do we draw the line? What exactly counts as unnecessary?
That's the million-dollar question. It's something that's been debated for centuries. The St. Petersburg Declaration, which we mentioned earlier, was an early attempt to address this. Remember, it banned exploding bullets specifically because they were seen as causing unnecessary suffering?
I remember. But with modern weapons, even those considered conventional things get a lot more complicated. A bullet kills just as effectively, whether it's a simple lead round or some high-tech armor-piercing projectile.
Exactly. And then there are weapons like white phosphorus munitions. They can cause horrific burns, but they're also very effective for illuminating targets or creating smoke screens.
So the suffering caused by white phosphorus is necessary in some situations, but unnecessary in others. It seems like it depends a lot on the context and the intent.
That's the crux of it. There's no simple formula. It comes down to making judgments based on a deep understanding of both the military necessities and the humanitarian implications.
Which is why organizations like the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, are so important. They're out there on the ground witnessing the effects of these weapons, gathering evidence, and advocating for stronger protections for civilians.
Absolutely. The work of the ICRC and other human rights groups helps to inform the legal debates, put pressure on states to abide by IHL, and ultimately push for a more humane way of waging war.
We've been talking a lot about international law and institutions, but what role do domestic courts play in enforcing these principles?
That's a key question for Indian legal studies. India, as a signatory to the Geneva Conventions, has incorporated many of its provisions into its own domestic laws.
So if an Indian soldier commits a war crime, they can be prosecuted in an Indian court.
That's right. And there have been cases where Indian courts have addressed issues related to IHL, such as the treatment of prisoners of war and the use of force in conflict situations.
That's interesting. So it's not just about international pressure. There's a responsibility for individual countries to enforce these principles within their own legal systems.
Exactly. It reinforces the idea that IHL isn't just some abstract set of rules, it's a binding legal framework with real consequences for those who violate it.
So far, we've focused mainly on state actors. But what about non-state actors, like armed groups or rebel movements? How does IHL apply to them?
That's another big challenge. Traditional IHL was developed with states in mind. But even though non-state armed groups aren't bound by treaties in the same way, they're still subject to what's called customary international law. These are rules that have become so widely accepted that they're considered binding on all parties in a conflict, regardless of whether they've formally signed a treaty.
So even if an armed group hasn't ratified the Geneva Conventions, they're still expected to adhere to the basic principles of humanity in warfare.
Yes, and there's a growing body of jurisprudence, both at the international and domestic levels, that deals specifically with the application of IHL to non-state actors. For example, the International Criminal Court, ICC, has jurisdiction over war crimes committed in non-international armed conflicts, which often involve these groups.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But holding non-state actors accountable seems a lot trickier than dealing with states.
It is. It often requires cooperation from states, creative legal strategies, and a willingness to adapt existing frameworks to these new realities.
This is all so complex. It feels like the field of IHL is constantly trying to catch up with the changing nature of war itself.
That's a great way to put it. And that's precisely what makes it such a fascinating and important area of study. It's not just about memorizing rules. It's about grappling with these complex ethical and legal dilemmas, understanding the roles of different actors, and constantly striving to find ways to uphold humanity in the face of unimaginable cruelty.
It's been really eye-opening.
Yeah.
And you made it clear that IHL is about more than just abstract legal principles. It reflects our shared values and our hopes for a more just and humane world, even in the midst of conflict.
Absolutely. And as we move forward, especially with new technologies and the increasing complexity of conflict, it's crucial to remember that these principles aren't just words on paper. They represent a commitment to protecting human life and dignity, even in the most challenging circumstances.
I completely agree.
Mhm.
We've talked a lot about the legal frameworks and the different actors involved. But what about the human element? What about the soldiers, the commanders, the civilians caught in the crossfire? How do these principles actually play out in real-world decisions and actions?
That's a great transition, and it's what we'll be discussing as we move into the final part of our deep dive.
Yeah, you're right. We've been looking at the big picture, the legal frameworks, the international debates.
Uh-huh.
But war ultimately comes down to people,
Right.
making decisions, often split-second ones,
Yeah.
under immense pressure.
Exactly, and that's where the psychological dimension of warfare comes into play. How do soldiers deal with the constant threat of death, the moral dilemmas, the sheer chaos of the battlefield? And how do those experiences shape their understanding of military necessity and the principle of humanity?
It's got to be incredibly difficult to process all of that. I imagine it's easy to become desensitized to violence, to see the enemy as less than human, especially after witnessing atrocities or losing comrades.
Yeah, that's a real danger. And it's why training is so crucial. Soldiers need to be equipped not only with the technical skills to fight, but also with the ethical and legal framework to make the right decisions even under extreme stress.
So it's not just about knowing the rules, but about internalizing them, making them part of their core values.
Precisely. And that's where strong leadership comes in. Commanders have a huge responsibility to set the tone, to enforce discipline, and to ensure that their troops understand and respect international humanitarian law. It's about fostering a culture of accountability and respect for human dignity, even in the heat of battle.
It sounds like a delicate balancing act for a commander. On one hand, they need to be decisive and lead their troops to achieve military objectives, but on the other, they need to restrain their troops and prevent unnecessary bloodshed, upholding those principles of humanity we've been discussing.
It's one of the toughest jobs imaginable, and it's made even more challenging by the fact that the battlefield is often chaotic and unpredictable. Split-second decisions can have life-or-death consequences.
Which brings us back to the issue of accountability. If a soldier does commit a war crime, who's ultimately responsible? Is it just the individual soldier, or does the chain of command bear some responsibility as well?
International criminal law has been grappling with this question for decades. The concept of command responsibility holds commanders accountable for the actions of their subordinates, especially if they knew or should have known about crimes being committed and failed to prevent or punish them.
So it's not just about giving orders, it's about ensuring those orders are carried out in accordance with the law.
Exactly. It requires effective training, clear communication, and a culture of accountability within the military. This applies to India as much as any other country.
This all makes me wonder about the long-term psychological impact of war, not just on soldiers, but on civilians as well. The trauma, displacement, loss of loved ones, destruction of homes and communities. These are wounds that can take generations to heal.
You're absolutely right, and that's why the concept of jus post bellum is gaining traction. It refers to the legal and moral obligations that extend beyond the cessation of hostilities, focusing on rebuilding infrastructure, providing psychological support for victims, and ensuring justice for those who have suffered.
So it's not just about winning the war, but about winning the peace as well.
Precisely. It requires a holistic approach that addresses the social, economic, and psychological dimensions of conflict, not just the military aspects.
This deep dive has really opened my eyes to the complexities of international humanitarian law, from the grand principles to the incredibly challenging task of applying them in real-world situations. We've debated the ethics of warfare, the importance of accountability, and the constantly evolving nature of conflict itself.
It's been a fascinating journey, and I hope our conversation has encouraged you to explore these issues further.
For our listeners in Indian legal studies, this field is ripe with opportunities. India, as a major player on the global stage, has a crucial role to play in shaping the future of international humanitarian law.
And as we wrap up our deep dive, I want to leave you with one final thought. The principles we've discussed: military necessity, the principle of humanity, distinction, proportionality, precautions, and attack. These aren't just legal concepts, they're reflections of our shared humanity, our aspiration for a world where even in the midst of conflict, we strive to uphold dignity, minimize suffering, and protect the most vulnerable.
It's a powerful message and one that's incredibly relevant in today's world. So as we sign off, I encourage you to keep exploring, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep striving to make the world a more humane and just place for all. Thanks for listening. Subscribe to LexTalks and stay informed.